then Facebook's like, well, we think they're just being not nice, so... Oh, sounds like... You know what, I'm not even gonna go there. I'm not even gonna go there. Alright, let me... What up, it's your girl. If you're watching the last feed, that was it involuntarily, it cut out, so that sucked, but I had to go to the bathroom anyways, so it's whatever. We left off on towards the end of chapter 6 of The Color of Law. So we're gonna finish that up. I'm probably gonna do another chapter, and then we're gonna possibly switch out, or maybe I'll keep reading. Don't know. Whatever happens, happens. So we had left off. I just explained this this visual here. I'm gonna show it now that it can be actually seen, and I'm within arm's reach of the camera. And it's talking about, the caption is, in the Lawndale neighborhood of Chicago, community opposition to evictions of contract buyers was so strong that sheriffs were often needed to prevent owners and neighbors from carrying belongings back in. So I kind of spoke about protests to evictions that we've been seeing a lot during the pandemic. There's been a lot of it in like the San Francisco area. I've been kind of checking in on every now and then. And there's actually a local group that's kind of advocating against evictions and kind of trying to help people out with that. But I spoke about how it's very similar, how we're seeing in this picture. It's very similar to... Hi, good morning, good afternoon. It's very similar to what we're seeing in the modern days of, protesters being stationed outside people's homes to push back on the police coming in and trying to evict families. So we've seen a lot of that, especially during the pandemic, them trying to evict people who aren't making rent because, it's hard out there already for people to make ends meet. And with the pandemic, that's just exacerbated that inability and that stress. So a lot of people have been even struggling more to be able to make ends meet. And so it's resulted in a lot of evictions, a lot of attempted evictions, and in some cases, protests that people show up and they say, you're not evicting this family is going to stay here, you're not going to put this family out in the street. And so they kind of intervene and prevent police from being able to do that. And it seemed like, in this situation in Lawndale decades ago, that was still a very that was still a thing that was happening. It was just when it was probably starting up. And neighbors and friends would encircle these homes and say, you can't evict families that are living here just because they're black or just because they're late on a payment or things like that. And so they would bring out the police to basically step in and prevent these people from being able to protest or prevent these people from being able to return back into the homes once they had been people came in and took all their stuff out of the house, preventing them from being able to try and go back and occupy the home. So we got a couple of paragraphs of this chapter 6 left, and then we'll get into chapter 7. Although banks and savings and loan associations typically refuse to issue mortgages to ordinary homeowners in African American or in integrated neighborhoods, all with the approval of federal bank regulators who failed their constitutional responsibilities. Oh, sorry, I skipped. So I'll just start over. Although banks and savings and loans associations typically refuse to issue mortgages to ordinary homeowners in African American or integrated neighborhoods, the same institutions issued mortgages to blockbusters in those neighborhoods, all with the approval of federal bank regulators who failed their constitutional responsibilities. State real estate regulators also defaulted on their obligations when they licensed real estate brokers who engaged in blockbusting. Instead, regulators looked the other way when the real estate boards expelled brokers who sold to African Americans in stable white neighborhoods. Blockbusting, the subsequent loss of home values when speculators caused panic, the subsequent deterioration of neighborhood quality when African Americans were forced to pay excessive prices for housing, the resulting identification of African Americans with slum conditions, and the resulting white flight escape the possibility of those conditions all had their bases in federal government policy. Blockbusting could work only because the FHA made certain that African Americans had few alternative neighborhoods where they could purchase homes at a fair market value. So we have, we're in arm's reach now, so we're just, whoop. So we have a imagery, it's like a lawn, and there are for sale signs on this lawn.
Hey, wait, before you go into the next chapter, can I ask you a few questions?
Oh, sure.
Was that the first chapter you read, or the?
I have questions.
Okay. Alright. I'm not going to get all the way in the picture. I'm going to just be like off to the side. Okay, so was that the first chapter of this book that you read, or the second chapter? How much have you read so far in here?
I believe I started at the fourth chapter, so that's the third chapter. Yeah, I started at this one, so I'm 3 chapters in.
Okay. Okay, first let me ask you, what do you think about the pictures that you've seen at the beginning of each one of these chapters?
I think that imagery is very powerful. I think that in a lot of the books that we're reading, to see something described as opposed to having it pictured doesn't really do the description justice. It doesn't really do the imagery justice to kind of have to picture in your mind these situations. But when I look at things like I kind of described or showed the picture before the last chapter 6 that I just read, of this woman sitting outside on a stoop with all her stuff having been moved out of, the place that she was living, and her just looking, kind of defeated, not knowing where to go from here. It provides like a completely different, well, I wouldn't say completely different, but it provides sort of a different context to the situation, to be able to see with your own eyes, like, these things happening, to be able to see. And I think that also, it's not like super duper related, but they talk about a lot of pictures of like Martin Luther King Jr. And how they're in black and white, when a lot of the photos taken at that time were actually in picture, to make it seem like, this happened way longer. This wasn't in, recent history or the last couple of decades or in the last, couple of generations of people that are still alive. And so to see pictures in here, even if they are in black and white, that's still, in context, it alludes to that it wasn't as far, it wasn't a whole century. Well, actually, it was a whole century. Or almost a whole century. Almost a whole century. Almost a whole century.
Some of these in here, they span through different decades.
Right. Right. So a lot of what they're talking about is like 20s, in the 20s. So
It's barely coming up on us.
yeah. So but it's still, it's still a recent thing. There are still people who are that age. There are still people who who could have recollection or memories of those times and things that we're doing, things that people were doing through those times, and policies that were enacted or upheld in those times. And so it's not, if it's in somebody's lifetime, you can't really argue that it was so long ago, because no, there are people that are alive today that, had those experiences and lived through that. So it's in somebody's, multiple people's lifetimes that that these situations would have been a reality for them. So to show imagery shows that, this was relatively recent. It was in, certain people's lifetimes that this was all going on, and that, even though it was decades and decades and decades ago, at the same time, it was recent enough to where we haven't changed a lot of these policies, or people who are alive today still had to live through that. And so I think that it's very powerful to include imagery to showcase the reality of time, the relativity of time, and how it feels like it was so long ago, but also it wasn't that long ago, and it was so long ago that it should have changed, but it also wasn't that long ago because not much has changed. And so I think that providing imagery provides more to the context that you may not be able to get, or probably not getting, just from reading a description, or reading a caption, or reading, that you're getting through text.
Okay. I'm going to let you go back to reading, but I just had a few more questions. Okay, so with that being said, now let me ask you, while going through and reading these things, a lot of times we've been trying to make sure we cross-reference to things that's going on here in Rockford, or how it might relate to things here in Rockford, but also we've been cross-referencing book to book, like how things in one book interrelate to another book. And so this is something that I asked Ari as well. I haven't got a chance to ask Terry this, but as you go through and you read about the systematic and systemic way that they sectioned off neighborhoods and turned neighborhood, and it was, I don't know which parts you've read, but one of the parts in there, they speak about how in certain neighborhoods they were already integrated, and they went in and they segregated it, and and then in turn made it black and white, made the black people live here and the white people live here, and then let the they talked about how slums develop with them divesting resources and then keeping up with the neighborhoods and things like that. So how different do you think that something like the war on drugs would look if integration was something that was actually happening, that was actually actually implemented, in, instead of it being because one of the things me and Ari talked about too was that what happened was you would actually have, and this is something that I think black people don't remember that well, and it's taken me a while to think about it, but you would have a black neighborhood where it was black affluent people in this neighborhood. They just couldn't live nowhere else, so even though that they may have been quote unquote in the ghetto, or quote unquote in the bad part of the city or whatever, they still had enough money. They just didn't have a way to move out of that situation. And so it was easier as the 60s, 70s and 80s and 90s, even how home owning goes on, if you got only a certain amount of money and you want to own your home still, and you can't go buy a home anywhere else, you just buy the home in the black, part of the city, and then you still pass the home on. So eventually these areas that become poverty neighborhoods, they weren't always necessarily like that. It was a black neighborhood. And so it did become easier in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to enact this war on drugs, as opposed to if integration would have truly worked, the war on drugs would become, do you think the war on drugs would have became a class issue versus a race issue if some of these things would have, actually happened? What Ari said, I'll let you answer after that, but what Ari said was that he doesn't feel like America is the type of country that would have allowed integration to actually happen. But so yeah, that's sort of leading. But
Yeah, I think that was a trick question.
I don't agree with that. I don't agree with his.
Yeah, so I don't think that, I mean, there was a lot of pushback, not only specifically in that situation, but there's a lot of pushback anytime you get the idea to integrate black people or people of color into society and into equality and equity any more than they were previously. There's going to be pushback to that. So if I would have thought that, back then it would have been possible for that to happen, and for them to just give in and not try to push back and find every little loophole that they could to continue to keep neighborhoods and cities segregated, I still think that the war on drugs would have been a race issue, because it's just one of the things that they were pushing back on. So they found that, okay, we lost this fight with integrating, integrating black people, integrating African Americans, people of color, and Irish people that they hated so much at that time. They found a way to basically fight all of those things, and were successful in integrating, schools and neighborhoods and everything like that. I think it was, and for what it was, the way that it happened, the way that it came to be, it was and is a way to get around that. So I think that the war on drugs probably would have started right around the time that integration would have happened. I think the war on drugs would have just started sooner, because it seemed like, because black people were being integrated into society more, they had to find a new reason to keep them away. And so they started taking them and putting them all in jail to keep them away from white people, to keep them segregated. So I think that it still would have very much been a class issue, or not a class issue, but a race issue. It still would have very much been a race issue, but it just would have started sooner. Instead of having segregation and, them trying to work a way around segregation through the 20s and 30s and 40s and then into the 50s, and then having the war on drugs start, in the 50s and going into the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. I think that, if they would have started to integrate earlier and have black people, trying to get them on the same level in the same neighborhoods and working the same jobs and everything, I think that the war on drugs would have just started earlier in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, because it was, a pushback to giving black people more rights. Okay, we're going to give you, a little bit more, but then we're going to take even more than that. So I think that they would have just started to the mass incarceration, the war on drugs, the raids and the unnecessary deaths and the violation of people's rights in their own homes. I think it would have just started earlier. I don't think that it would have just not happened at all, or it would have been done any differently. I think that it would have just came about at an earlier time than what it did.
Okay. And then last question, it's similar to the question I asked Ari too. I should ask you this first. Were there any, in the part that you read, did they speak about politicians at all, or anything that was going on politically around these things?
Yeah, they talked about court cases that they were doing, and basically it was federal law that states couldn't basically perpetuate racial discrimination. And so they kept trying to get around and find loopholes. The FHA kept trying to get around and find loopholes that would enable them to only give home loans to white neighborhoods or to white families, to only give loans to people who promise not to resell their homes to black people, and things like that. And what would end up happening is, if that was violated, or a black person ended up moving in, or a white person sold their home to a black person, they were trying to take them to court, and the court would typically rule in their favor and evict the black person initially. But then they had ruled that states could not enforce that, because it would be considered racial discrimination, or discrimination, housing discrimination based on race. And so they ruled at a federal level that they were not allowed to do that anymore. And it's like they went back to the drawing board and tried to figure out more ways to create loopholes in which they would dissuade black people from buying or purchasing homes in certain areas, and then try to get white people to not buy those or sell those homes to black people in the predominantly white areas. And so it just kind of it I don't really.
Oh, damn, my fault.
It was just.
Okay. As for what about like so in here, and one of the portions that we read, it says following the war, Detroit's politicians mobilized white voters by stirring up fear of integration in public housing. Mayor Edward Jeffrey's successful 1945 re-election campaign warned that projects with African Americans could be located in white neighborhoods if his opponent Dick Frankenstein won. Jeffries' literature proclaimed, "Mayor Jeffries is against mixed housing." One leaflet distributed in white neighborhoods but pretending to be addressed to African Americans suggested that a vote for Frankenstein would bring black families to white communities. It read, "Negroes can live anywhere with Frankenstein mayor. Negroes, do your duty, November 6th. Okay, so I bring that up to say, even early as in the 1940s, and I'm sure earlier than that, this was just the first one I seen in this time of me reading the book, politicians were sort of using race, making race a political thing, and using race as sort of like a voting tool. We still see it today, as far as Joe Biden was saying, if you're black, you're not black if you don't vote for me, and Donald Trump saying, what do you have to lose if you're black? What do you have to lose? And even though the language may have changed, well, one of the things Nixon did a lot that doesn't get spoken about much is he was one of the first people to put in the lexicon the idea of black capitalism, and so I say that to say, since these politicians, even dating back to this time, have been being elected and being put into office, at any point, it could have been a drawing line where we stopped allowing black to be something that's politicized. Or black, that's one of the problems with Black Lives Matter, is that people view anything that has black next to it as a political statement, because it's been used as a political statement as opposed to being looked at as a human statement or a human rights thing. How much of that blame lies with the community and with the people and with society, as opposed to the politicians who, the politicians are more like thermometers, taking the temperature of the room and figuring out what the temperature of the room is, and they'll sway whichever way to get votes. It's rare that you get a politician that honestly believes half the things that he's saying anyways, as opposed to, the people being the thermostat, and so they're setting the temperature and the climate for what is allowed and isn't allowed. So, how much do you think the people are to blame for politicians, politicizing being black? Whether it be black people, white people, just people in general,
I think that, they're a lot to blame because they go along with it. They're the voters, and at the end of the day, you have a choice to cast your vote for any one person, and then at the same time you have the right to not cast a vote for any particular person at all. And honestly, I'd like to see more of people just not voting for people. Like if we all collectively, you know, people on the left and people on the right don't like Tom McNamara. So if everybody went into that voting booth and just left the mayor spot blank, even though he's the only person that, you know, would be on there, or if he was, you know, running unopposed, and it was, you know, check one person, and you thought, well, there's only one person to vote for, so I might as well check that person. Like, we need to stop thinking like that. You have the ability to not vote for anyone. You have the ability to vote for any one particular person, but at the same time, you have the right to not vote for anyone. So if we collectively all went in there and, well, not we, no, we, but if, you know, if everybody went in there and said, you know, we don't want Tom, and nobody checked that box to vote for Tom, he would lose. It doesn't matter. If he all he needs is one vote. He can go in there and vote for himself, and he would win. And he would be the only one that voted for him, but he would still win. But it's the fact that, you know, people run unopposed, or people think that it's just a two-party system, and so they don't consider, you know, independent voters. So everybody looks at these two parties, and these two parties understand that they're likely going to get, you know, half or more of the vote. And so at that point, all they need to do is just cater to the majority, because all they need is the majority vote. So they, you know, they don't need the extra stuff. If it's, you know, a party or an election of one person, they know that, you know, they don't got to do. I haven't seen no type of campaigning for Tom, no type of commercials or any advertisements or anything, because all he needs is one person to go in there and check that box, and he, you know, he wins. So I think that people who are in elections where they have an opponent or opponents, all they have to do is get the votes. All they have to do is cater to the majority. But at some point, you know, somewhere they started to realize that, you know, black people are voting more for their interests. So all you have to do is get, you know, prominent black people. And then typically what would happen was all the black people who respect those prominent black people are likely to follow suit. So if you get, you know, what they consider big names or big politicians that are people of color, or big artists or celebrities or whoever, you know, cater to them, then, you know, sit down and have interviews with them. Biden sat down and had an interview with Cardi B. Come on now. And I know she's not, you know, she's not politically ignorant. I wouldn't go that far. She, you know, she has an idea of a lot of the issues and stuff like that. But at the same time, she got money.
Yeah, he sat down with her to pander. It was, you know, it's a different version of.
You're gonna sit down with somebody with money and get their take. Like, you know, she's Cardi B. She don't have to worry about none of that stuff. People may, you know, say stuff in the comments, you know, Twitter or on Facebook or shit like that. But I don't think Cardi B will ever have to, again, go through what it is that, you know, the average black person would have to go through. But she would know, you know, she lived a completely different life before she got popular. So she still has an understanding of what it is like to live that life, but she's at a different point in her life right now. So her perception and her experience at this time is not going to match up with the average person of color. The average person of color that's just walking out here, no security, no person to, you know, watch out for them, nobody, you know, not an abundance of expendable money and all of that stuff, like, we're not going to have the same experience. And so if you're really trying to help, or if you're really trying to get to a point where we're seeking equity, then you shouldn't be having these discussions with prominent black people who have money, who aren't going to have the same experience as the average black person anywhere in America, because it's not going to be the same. Their view is not going to be the same. Their perception is not going to be the same. Their experience at this time is not going to be the same. And I would argue that, it would seem that there has been very little, but some small progress that has been made since Cardi B has become popular. But she wouldn't know that even though those small changes have been made, or those small things that have been implemented that improve for a very small percentage of black folks, their daily experience, that overall not much has really changed. So, somebody can sit down with her and say, we've done this, 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 and this, but overall, again, the experience for the average black person anywhere in America has not really changed by much at all. So I think that for these people that have not been affected by any of these new policies that have been implemented, people that are still, in fear for their life of either gang violence or mass incarceration or police terrorism, not much has really changed for these people. So I think that it is pandering, because you're not really trying to cater to the minorities. You're not trying to understand what their experience is like and how you can better that. You're trying to be performative and get votes. So in that aspect, yeah, I think it's pandering. They're just trying to get votes. They understand that, okay, they may not get the majority of the, white votes, and so they got to go find votes from other places that we've seen in places like Georgia can make an entire election. So, it's at that point they're just trying to get elected. They're trying to get in office. So it doesn't matter if they come through on any of those promises. It doesn't matter how little they do to actually change the experience of the average black person. It's just the look and the narrative that they gotta put out there, that, oh, we care and we want things to be better, so vote for us and we'll look into doing that. But it's not really, not much is really done. They just give us some little things here and there to make it, paint a fucking city sidewalk or paint a city street with Black Lives Matter, and think that it's going to do anything, think that it's going to bring people back from being killed by the police, or think that it's going to prevent anybody in the future from being killed by police. And, they stand out there and they do their photo ops. Tom loves to do photo ops, but really, how much has changed? Even him, he's, he'll post things up for Black History Month, or will post about Martin Luther King, or even posted after some of the protests with seemingly supportive messages. But we'll still, back 100%, back the blue. But we'll still allow and likely encourage his workers to repeatedly call the police on protesters because they're taking up too much space on a sidewalk, or because they berated people that were ripping down and desecrating memorials to people that the city has killed. And so it's performative, and it's pandering to get votes, 100%.
Okay, I have pulled you away for too long. I'm going to give you
All right.
your book back.
All right.
Awesome.
The Book of the People.
Book of the People, communities book.
Sorry, I'm trying to adjust. Okay. It's bright out here. Okay. So chapter 7, I had kind of flashed this picture. A picture, if you can see. It's a lawn. It's got some for sale signs going, a couple of places for sale going down the each lot of the lawns. And it says, Denver, 1961. When a few African Americans moved to a middle-class white neighborhood, speculators panicked white homeowners into selling at a deep discount. So we got Chapter 7, IRS support and compliant regulators. As public housing packed African Americans into urban projects, and federal loan insurance subsidized white families to disperse into single-family suburban homes, other racial policies of federal, state, and local governments contributed to and reinforced the segregation of metropolitan areas. One was the willingness of the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, to grant tax-exempt status to churches, hospitals, universities, neighborhood associations, and other groups that promoted residential segregation. Another was the complicity of regulatory agencies and the discriminatory actions of insurance companies and banks they supervised. The color of law does not argue that merely because government regulates a private business, the firm's activities become state action and, if discriminatory, constitute de jure segregation. Such a claim would eliminate the distinction between the public and private spheres to be inimical to a free democratic society. But because of slavery's legacy, the Constitution gives African Americans a special degree of protection. The 3 constitutional amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, adopted after the Civil War, were specifically intended to ensure that African Americans had equal status. When government regulation is so intrusive that it blesses systematic racial exclusion, regulators violate their constitutional responsibilities and contribute to de jure segregation. Real estate brokers don't become government agents simply by dint of their state licensure. But when state real estate commissions license members of local and national real estate boards whose published codes of ethics mandated discrimination, acts to establish de jure segregation were committed. Similarly, universities, churches, and other nonprofit institutions cannot be considered state actors simply by dint of their tax exemptions. But we have a right to expect the IRS to have been especially vigilant and to have withheld tax-exempt status when the promotion of segregation by nonprofit institutions was blatant, explicit, and influential. The IRS has always had an obligation to withhold tax favoritism from discriminatory organizations, but it almost never acted to do so. Its regulations specifically authorize charitable deductions for organizations that eliminate prejudice and discrimination and defend human and civil rights secured by law. The IRS leadership recognized this in 1967 when the agency exercised its authority to withhold the tax exemption of a recreational facility that excluded African Americans. Yet, until 1970, 16 years after Brown v. Board of Education, the IRS granted tax exemptions to private whites-only academies that had been established throughout the South to evade the ruling. It rejected the exemptions only in response to a court injunction won by civil rights groups. In 1976, when the IRS denied the tax exemption of Bob Jones University because the school would not allow interracial dating by its students. The university mounted a court challenge to the IRS action, and when the case reached the Supreme Court, the Reagan administration refused to defend the agency. So the Supreme Court appointed an outside lawyer, William T. Coleman, Jr., to make the argument that the government itself should have presented. Coleman's brief asserted that, indeed, if the charitable organization provision of the IRS code were instructed to permit tax exemptions for racially discriminatory schools, the provision would be unconstitutional under the Fifth Amendment. The government has an affirmative constitutional duty to steer clear of providing significant aid to such schools. In its widely noticed 1983 decision, the court upheld the IRS decision and concluded that an institution seeking tax-exempt status must serve a public purpose and not be contrary to established public policy. It did not adopt Coleman's constitutional argument to make its case, but neither did the court reject it. In his opinion, Chief Justice Warren Burger wrote that many of those who submitted briefs in the case, including Coleman, argue that denial of tax-exempt status to racially discriminatory schools is independently required by the equal protection component of the Fifth Amendment. In light of our resolution of this litigation, we do not reach that issue. But Coleman's argument was solid, and it implicitly condemned the decades-long passivity of the IRS by confronting how its tax exemption policy strengthened residential segregation. Support for a ban on interracial dating certainly offended the Constitution, but its national policy significance was trivial in comparison to the IRS's silence when nonprofit institutions promoted restrictive covenants or engaged in other activities to prevent African Americans from moving into white neighborhoods. Churches, synagogues, and their clergy frequently led such efforts. Shelley V. Cramer, the 1948 Supreme Court ruling that ended court enforcement of restrictive covenants, offers a conspicuous illustration. The case stemmed from objections of white St. Louis homeowners, Lewis and Fern Cramer, to the purchase of a house in their neighborhood by African Americans J.D. and Ethel Shelley. The area had been covered by a restrictive covenant organized by a white owners group, the Marcus Avenue Improvement Association, which was sponsored by the Cote Brilliant Presbyterian Church. Trustees of the church provided funds from the church treasury to finance the Cramers' lawsuit to have the African American family evicted. Another nearby church, the Wagner Place Methodist Episcopal Church South, was also a signatory to the restrictive covenant. Its pastor had defended the clause in a 1942 legal case arising from the purchase of a nearby house by Scoville Richardson, a distinguished attorney who later became one of the first African Americans nationwide appointed to the federal judiciary. Such church involvement and leadership were commonplace in property owners' associations that were organized to maintain neighborhood segregation. Churches funded these organizations that would sue and apply, or basically have these contracts to be able to continue segregation to keep black people out of predominantly white neighborhoods. In North Philadelphia in 1942, a priest spearheaded a campaign to prevent African Americans from living in the neighborhood. The same year, a priest in a Polish American parish in Buffalo, New York, directed the campaign to deny public housing for African American war workers, stalling a proposed project for 2 years. Just south of the city, 600 units in the federally managed project for whites went vacant, while African American war workers could not find adequate housing. In Los Angeles, the Reverend W. Clarence Wright, pastor of the fashionable Wilshire Presbyterian Church, led efforts to keep the Wilshire district all white. He personally sued to evict an African American war veteran who had moved into the restricted area in 1947. Wright, who was a reverend, lost the case one of the few times before Shelley in a state which one of the few times before Shelley in which a state court held covenants to be unconstitutional. In a widely publicized ruling, the judge said that there was no more reprehensible un-American activity than to attempt to deprive persons of their own homes on a master race theory. So this pastor went and tried to sue to have a black family or black couple or black person evicted from their home, and the judge told him that there is nothing more un-American than for you to try and come in my court and have this person evicted from their home just because they are black and you want to keep segregation in place. You want to keep your neighborhood all white. There is nothing more American than to be, there's nothing more un-American than to be racist. There is nothing more un-American than to discriminate against somebody based off of their race. Yet, the IRS took no notice. Reverend Wright's activities didn't threaten his church's tax subsidy. The violent resistance to the Sojourner Truth public housing project for African American families in Detroit was organized by a homeowners association headquartered in St. Louis, the King Catholic Church, whose pastor, the Reverend Constantine DeZink, represented the association in appeals to the United States Housing Authority to cancel the project. The construction of a low-cost housing project in the vicinity for the colored people would mean utter ruin for many people who have mortgaged their homes to the FHA. And not only that, but it would jeopardize the safety of many of our white girls. Reverend DeZink wrote, adding this warning: "It is the sentiment of all people residing within the vicinity to object against this project in order to stop race riots in the future." And this wasn't it doesn't seem like we're scared that the black people are going to start rioting. It was like, if you don't want us to raise hell and start attacking them, maybe you don't build housing for them around us. It was very much a threat. It wasn't a fear of an event happening. It said, if you do this, this is probably going to happen, so you should not do that. So basically, in retaliation of integration, these people, these Catholic priest-led or church reverend-led organizations or funded organizations basically stood up and said, if you integrate these neighborhoods, or if you build subsidies homes, particularly for housing African Americans, then we're gonna start a fucking race war. That was the energy they were keeping. On Chicago's South Side, signatures on a 1928 restrictive covenant were obtained in door-to-door solicitations by the priest of St. Anselm Catholic Church. The rabbi of a congregation, Beth Jacob, and the executive director of the area's Property Owners Association. Trinity Congregational Church was also party to the agreement. In 1946, the Congregational Church of Park Manor sponsored a local improvement association's efforts to cancel an African American physician's home purchase in the previously all-white neighborhood. So basically these churches got together and was trying... Okay, all right. Who's getting a call? Missed it. All right. So these pastors and these rabbis and these churches all got together to try and intervene from a black person buying a home in a all-white neighborhood. On Chicago's near North Side, a restrictive covenant was executed in 1937 by tax-exempt religious institutions, including the Moody Bible Institute, the Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and the Board of Foreign Missions of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Other nonprofit organizations also participated, including the Newberry Library and the Academy of Fine Arts. Tax-exempt colleges and universities, some religious affiliated and some not, were also active in promoting segregation. Tax-exempt colleges and universities, some religious affiliated and some not, were also active in promoting segregation. So, you know, the policies of segregation and the things that they lawfully allowed were being pushed and spearheaded by organizations, churches, and universities and schools that didn't even have to pay taxes. So, you know, there's the idea that your contribution to society allows you to, you know, have a say, have a voice. And these organizations that contributed nothing, contributed no finances, no nothing, were exempt from taxes, were not only being allowed to voice their opinions, but their opinions and their push for segregation was being considered more than those organizations like the NAACP or other civil rights groups. On Chicago's near North Side, a restrictive covenant was executed in Oh wait, no, we passed that. My bad. In Whittier, a Los Angeles suburb, the Quaker-affiliated Whittier College participated in a restrictive covenant covering its neighborhood. The University of Chicago organized and guided property owners associations that were devoted to preventing black families from moving nearby. The university not only subsidized the associations, but from 1933 to 1947 spent $100,000 on legal services to defend covenants and evict African Americans who had arrived in its neighborhood. When criticized for the activities, University of Chicago President Robert Maynard Hutchins wrote in 1937 that the university must endeavor to stabilize its neighborhood as an area in which its students and faculty will be content to live, and that therefore the university had the right to invoke and defend restrictive covenants in its surrounding areas. Insurance companies also participated in segregation. They have large reserve funds to invest, and because they are heavily regulated, state policy makers are frequently involved in plans for any housing projects that insurers propose. In 1938, when Frederick Ecker, president of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, wanted to build the 12,000-unit Parkchester Apartments in New York City, he could not proceed without an amendment to the state's insurance code permitting insurers to invest in low-rent housing. The state legislature adopted the amendment, fully aware that it was authorizing a project from which African Americans would be excluded. After Parkchester was completed in 1942, Metropolitan Life embarked on a new project, the 9,000-unit Stuyvesant townhousing complex in the east side of Manhattan. For the development, New York City condemned and cleared 18 square city blocks and transferred the property to the insurance company. The city also granted Metropolitan Life a 25-year tax abatement whose value meant that far more public than private money was invested in the project. The subsidies were granted despite Metropolitan Life's announcement that, like Parkchester, the project would be for white people only. Ecker advised the New York City Board of Estimate that Negroes and whites don't mix. If we brought them into this development, it would depress all of the surrounding property. Because of the project's refusal to accept African Americans, the board was divided whether to allow it to proceed. It eventually paired its approval with an ordinance forbidding racial segregation and any subsequent developments for which the city had to engage in slum clearance. In response to public protest against its policy of excluding African Americans from Stuyvesant Town, Metropolitan Life built the Riverton Houses, a smaller development for African Americans in Harlem. Abiding by the new ordinance, the project was open to whites, but in practice, it rented almost exclusively to African American families. In 1947, a New York state court rejected a challenge to Stuyvesant Town's racial exclusion policy. The decision was upheld on appeal in 1949. The U.S. Supreme Court declined review. The following year, the New York State Legislature enacted a statute prohibiting racial discrimination in any housing that receives state aid in the form of a tax exemption. The same year, Metropolitan Life finally agreed to lease some apartments in Stuyvesant Town to qualified Negro tenants. But by then, the development was filled. New York City's rent control laws, by which existing tenants pay significantly less than market rate rents, helped to ensure that turnover would be slow. Rapidly rising rents in apartments that had been vacated made the development increasingly unaffordable to middle-income families. These conditions combined to make the initial segregation of Stuyvesant Town nearly permanent. By the 2010 census, only 4% of Stuyvesant Town residents were African American, in a New York metropolitan area that was 15% African American. As in so many other instances, the low-income neighborhood that the city raised to make way for Stuyvesant Town had been integrated and stable. About 40% of those evicted were African American or Puerto Rican, and many of them had no alternative but to move to racially isolated communities elsewhere in the city and beyond. Although New York ceased to allow furniture discrimination in publicly subsidized projects, it made no effort to remediate the segregation it had created. Even when mortgage loans were not insured by the FHA or the VA, banks and savings, thrift institutions pursued discriminatory policies. Banks and thrifts, however, are private institutions. Can it fairly be said that these discriminatory lending activities contributed to de jure segregation? I think so. Government deposit insurance programs underwrite bank and thrift institution profits. In return, there is an extensive oversight of lending practices. Examiners from the Federal Reserve, the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, and the Office of Thrift Supervision all have regularly reviewed loan applications and other financial records of bank and savings and loan offices to ensure that lending practices were sound. Banks and thrifts were able to refuse service to African Americans only because, until recently, federal and state regulators chose to allow it. The Federal Home Loan Bank Board, for example, chartered, insured, and regulated savings and loan associations from the early years of the New Deal, but did not oppose the denial of mortgages to African Americans until 1961. It did not enforce the new race-blind policy, however. Perhaps it was in conflict with the board's insistence that mortgage eligibility account for economic factors. Like the FHA, it claimed that judging African Americans to be poor credit risk because they were black was not a racial judgment, but an economic one. As a result, its staff failed to remedy the industry's consistent support for segregation. In 1961, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights challenged regulators about their complicity in banks' redlining practices. Ray M. Gidney, then Comptroller of the Currency, responsible for chartering, supervising, regulating, and examining national banks, responded, "Our office does not maintain any policy regarding racial discrimination in the making of real estate loans by national banks." FDIC Chairman Earl Koch asserted that it was appropriate for banks under his supervision to deny loans to African Americans because whites' property values might fall if they had black neighbors. And Federal Reserve Board Chairman William McChesney Martin stated, "Neither the Federal Reserve nor any other bank supervisory agent has or should have authority to compel officers and directors of any bank to make any loan against their judgment." Martin's view was that federal regulators should only prohibit the approval of unsound loans, not require the non-discriminatory approval of sound loans. If a black family was denied a loan because of race, Martin asserted, the forces of competition, would ensure that another bank would come forward to make the loan. With his regulatory authority over all banks that were members of the Federal Reserve System, and with all such banks engaging in similar discriminatory practices, Martin surely knew, or should have known, that his claim was false. When regulated businesses engage in regulated businesses engage in systematic racial discrimination, when government regulation is intense, and when regulators openly endorse the racial discrimination carried out by the sector they are supervising, then in those cases the regulators ignore the civil rights they are sworn to uphold and contribute to de jure discrimination. As the Supreme Court once said, referring to banks chartered by the federal government, national banks are instrumentalities of the federal government, created for a public purpose. Racially discriminatory government activities did not end 50 years ago. On the contrary, some have continued into the 21st century. One of the more troubling has been the regulatory tolerance of banks' reverse redlining, excessive marketing of exploitative loans in African American communities. This was an important cause of the 2008 financial collapse because these loans, called subprime mortgages, were bound to go into default. When they did, lower middle class African American neighborhoods were devastated, and their residents, with their homes foreclosed, were forced back into lower income areas. In the early 2000s, reverse redlining was tolerated, sometimes winked at by bank regulators. Banks, thrift institutions, and mortgage companies designed subprime loans for borrowers who had a high risk of default, and they charged higher interest payments to subprime borrowers to compensate for that risk. In itself, this was a legitimate practice, but federally regulated banks and other lenders created many subprime loans with onerous conditions that were designed to make repayment difficult. These mortgages had high closing costs and prepayment penalties and low initial teaser interest rates that skyrocketed after borrowers were locked in. Some subprime loans also had negative amortization. Requirements for initial monthly payments were lower than needed to cover interest costs, with the difference then added to the outstanding principal. Borrowers should have been more careful before accepting loans they could not understand or reasonably repay, but they were victims of a market that was not transparent, in some cases deliberately not so. For example, mortgage broker compensation systems included incentives to pressure borrowers into accepting subprime mortgages without the brokers disclosing the consequences. Brokers received bonuses, in effect kickbacks, called yield spread premiums, or YSPs, if they made loans with interest rates higher than those recommended by their banks on formal rate sheets for borrowers with similar characteristics. Regulators and banks that purchased these mortgages from marketers did not require brokers to disclose to borrowers what these rate sheets specified. In 2010, Dodd-Frank Financial Reform and Consumer Protection Act banned YSPs. It took another year for the Federal Reserve to issue a rule implementing the ban, but borrowers who were deceived as a result of the kickback system are without recourse. Nothing, however, would have prevented the Federal Reserve from banning the practice years earlier. Brokers and loan officers manipulated borrowers by convincing them they could take advantage of perpetually rising equity to refinance their loans before the teaser rates expired and take cash out of the increased equity, with a share left as profit for the lending institution. But frequently, these mortgages were promoted and sold to African Americans who lived in distressed neighborhoods where little or no gain in equity could be expected, even before the housing bubble burst. In these areas where property values would be unlikely to appreciate, the scheme could not possibly work as promised, even if the nationwide housing boom continued. These discriminatory practices were widespread throughout the industry at least since the late 1990s, with little state or federal regulatory response. Data on lending disparities suggests that the discrimination was based on race, not on economic status. Among homeowners who had refinanced in 2000 as the subprime bubble was expanding, lower-income African Americans were more than twice as likely as lower-income whites to have subprime loans, and higher-income African Americans were about 3 times as likely as higher-income whites to have subprime loans. The most extreme case occurred in Buffalo, New York, where 3/4 of all refinanced loans to African Americans were subprime. In Chicago, borrowers in predominantly African American census tracts were 4 times as likely to have subprime loans as borrowers in predominantly white census tracts. And then there's a visual here. It's I try to. It's just homes on a block. It's like 5 houses on a street. With the caption, "Before the 2008 burst of a housing bubble, lenders targeted African American and Hispanic homeowners for the marketing of subprime refinance loans. When the economy collapsed, many homes went into foreclosure, devastating entire neighborhoods, like this block of boarded-up homes on Chicago's southwest side." So you can't particularly see in the photo, but the homes, the windows are boarded up. In 2000, 41% of all borrowers with subprime loans would have qualified for conventional financing with lower rates, a figure that increased to 61% in 2006. By then, African American mortgage recipients had subprime loans at 3 times the rate of white borrowers. 2006. Not that long ago. Hey.
What's going on?
Not much. What's going on with you?
Just checking out the apartment.
Okay, cool.
What are you up to?
We're reading books. We're going through for the month of April, and we're reading different books depending on the theme throughout the week. This week is racial injustice, and so we're reading about The Color of Law, and it's a forgotten history of how our government segregated America, and it talks about discriminatory housing practices and segregation, and how when they tried to start integrating African Americans into predominantly white neighborhoods, there was a lot of loopholes and things that they were trying to implement, different private contracts and things that said that anybody who was white that bought the house couldn't then go and sell to a black person, to basically keep these all white neighborhoods to stay all white. And it just, it just talks about these practices and how they were done to discriminate against black people and to get around the constitutional and civil rights of African Americans to not be discriminated against. So we have, I don't have any cards, but if you go to a group, there's a May 30th Alliance on Facebook. We're actually live streaming all of this throughout the entire month of April, and so you'll be able to just kind of hear myself and some other people that come out and read through a lot of these books. They're very, very educational, very educational. Yep, you too. Hi. Let's see here where we leave off. Higher income African Americans had subprime mortgages at 4 times the rate of higher income whites, even though its own survey in 2005 revealed a similar racial discrepancy. The Federal Reserve did not take action. By failing to curb discrimination that its own data disclose, the Federal Reserve violated African Americans' legal and constitutional rights. In 2010, the Justice Department agreed that the more segregated a community of color is, the more likely that homeowners will face foreclosure because the lenders who peddled the most toxic loans targeted those communities. And this is in 2010. We're talking about racial discrimination in communities. This is 2010. We're talking about policies and loopholes and predatory lending practices that targeted these segregated communities. Settling a lawsuit against the Countrywide Mortgage Company, later a subsidiary of the Bank of America, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Sean Donovan remarked that because of Countrywide's and other lending practices, from Jamaica, Queens, New York to Oakland, California, strong middle-class African-American neighborhoods saw nearly 2 decades of gains reversed in a matter of not years, but months. For those dispossessed after foreclosures, there has been greater homelessness, more doubling up with relatives, and more apartment rental in less stable neighborhoods where poor and minority families are more tightly concentrated. In its legal action against Countrywide, the government alleged that the statistical relationship between race and mortgage terms was so extreme that the top bank officials must have been aware of the racial motivation. And if top bank officials were aware, so too must have been the government regulators. Indeed, the Justice Department got involved only because Countrywide modified its government charter in 2007 so that the Office of Thrift Supervision assumed responsibility for its regulation from the Federal Reserve Board. The office noticed the racially tinged statistics and referred the lender to the Department of Justice for prosecution. The discriminatory practices had continued for years under the Federal Reserve's supervision. Several cities sued banks because of the enormous devastation that the foreclosure crisis imposed on African Americans. A case that the city of Memphis brought against Wells Fargo Bank was supported by the affidavits of bank employees stating that they referred to subprime loans as ghetto loans. Bank supervisors instructed their marketing staffs to target solicitation to heavily African American zip codes because residents there weren't savvy enough to know they were being exploited. A sales group sought out elderly African Americans believing they were particularly susceptible to pressure to take out high-cost loans. A similar suit by the city of Baltimore presented evidence that Wells Fargo established a unit staffed exclusively by African Americans whom supervisors instructed to visit black churches to market subprime loans. The bank had no similar practice of marketing such loans through white institutions. In 2008, the city of Cleveland sued a large group of subprime lenders, including Citicorp, the Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and others. The lawsuit alleged that the institutions should not have marketed any subprime loans in Cleveland's depressed black neighborhoods because the lenders knew that high poverty and unemployment rates and flat property values in those communities would preclude borrowers from capturing sufficient appreciation to lower the higher adjustable rates they faced once the initial low teaser rates expired. Cleveland's suit argued that the banks should be held liable for the harm they created, including loss of tax revenues and an increase in drug dealing and other crime in neighborhoods with many foreclosed and abandoned buildings. The city charged that the financial firms had created a public nuisance. A federal court dismissed the suit, concluding that because mortgage lending is so heavily regulated by the federal and state governments, there is no question that the subprime lending that occurred in Cleveland was conduct which the law sanctions. The consequences of racially targeted subprime lending continue to accumulate. As the housing bubble collapsed, African American homeownership rates fell much more than white rates. Families no longer qualify for conventional mortgages if they previously defaulted when they were unable to make exorbitant loan payments. For those families, the contract buying system of the 1960s is now making its return. Some of the same firms that exploited African Americans in the subprime crisis are now reselling foreclosed properties to low and moderate income households at high interest rates with high down payments and no equity accumulated until the contract period has ended, and with eviction possible after a single mispayment. By failing to ensure that banks fulfilled the public purposes for which they were chartered, regulators shared responsibility for reverse redlining of African American communities. When federal and state regulatory agencies chartered banks and thrift institutions which unhidden policy was racial discrimination, the agencies themselves defaulted on their constitutional obligations. So we got a picture of a guy. It's just a guy. And, actually, we're going to pause. We're going to pause real quick.
Oh, wow. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. You can hear me? Hello? You can hear me? Oh, wow. Oh, it's all right. Why would you say that to me? You saw how excited I was to drink it. Let me go.
It's so good. It's so good. I drank my whole bottle. It's right there on the ground.
What's up?
An hour until it rains again.
Got an hour till it rains again? Okay.
And it's going to be kind of spotty for a few hours.
What do you think about where would we move? Back to
Back to the front over there.
Back to the front over there.
Is the only place out of the rain.
We can hear you. Okay, good. So probably end this one. Move right now.
How long are the chapters?
She had just got done finishing this one, so we're at a new chapter. Well, the chapters they're not Jim Crow. They're not new Jim Crow chapters. No, they're not.
They are multi-part.
Yes, they are. This one.
Can you do that chapter in under an hour?
Let's see, about 24 pages. Probably. Okay, so we're gonna keep going. It's gonna rain about an hour. Let me go share this live. This is day 8, book 8. Let me make sure everything's good. Okay. Good morning from me. Okay. Chapter 8, local tactics. Okay. You gotta get comfortable. Let me try to get comfortable. Okay. Coconut water, a blessing. Chapter 8, local tactics. When Frank Stevenson and his carpoolers needed housing near the new Ford plant, FHA and VA-insured subdivisions were rapidly filling the area between Milpitas and the African-American community of Richmond and Oakland. The most active developers was David Bohannon, who had built the whites-only Rolling Wood subdivision just outside Richmond in 1943. The following year, he created the massive whites-only San Lorenzo Village, about 5 miles south of the Oakland border. With more than 5,000 units and 17,000 residents, San Lorenzo Village was the nation's largest wartime government-issued project, intended for workers at naval shipyards and support factories. Like the homes in Rollingwood, each house included a bedroom with a separate entrance, so the owner could rent it to another war worker. The development was financed by a $7 million FHA authorized loan from the Bank of America and the American Trust Company. As was the case with the other FHA developments, houses were sold at relatively low prices so as to be within reach of war workers, and the deeds include restrictive covenants to prevent future resales to African Americans. Within easy commuting distance of Milpitas, San Lorenzo Village was an ideal location for Ford workers. Sales brochures in the early to mid 1950s, when Ford workers would have been seeking housing in the area, assured prospective buyers that the village was a safe investment because far-sighted protective restrictions permanently safeguard your investment. In 1955, Bohannon began developing Sunny Hills, a project in Milpitas itself. After Western Pacific announced plans to create its new industrial zone. Other builders had also obtained FHA guarantees to construct whites-only single-family subdivisions in the area. One Milford Village, a development of 1,500 units on unincorporated land just outside the town boundaries, was guaranteed by the VA and required little or no down payment for veterans and low monthly payments. When it became apparent, wait for this car to go bad. When it became apparent that no existing Milpitas area development would sell or rent to black workers, the American Friends Service Committee, AFC, AFSC, that's what it is, a Quaker group, wow, committed to racial integration, offered to assist Ben Gross, the chair of the Ford Plants Union Housing Committee, by finding a developer who would agree to build the interracial subdivision. The AFSC had an existing campaign to press, unsuccessfully, Richmond to desegregate its public housing and to find adequate integrated residence for its African American population being displaced by the demolition of federal war projects. The group also operated a settlement house in North Richmond with after-school tutoring, dances, and other youth recreational opportunities. A well baby clinic. What's that? You know what a well baby clinic is? A well baby clinic? Mm-hmm. I don't know what that is. Anybody watching this right now, you know what a well baby clinic is? Leave it in the comments below. I never heard of no well baby clinic.
Well baby clinics or well child clinics, as are commonly known,
A daycare program for children of working parents, a small playground for toddlers, and a meeting room for community organization. Ford workers were involved in all these activities. The rapid growth of the Milpitas area had resulted in some overbuilding, and several new subdivisions had unsold units that were affordable to Ford workers. Despite this excess inventory, the AFSC was unsuccessful in persuading any existing developer to sell to African Americans. The first builder recruited by the AFSC selected a plot in an unincorporated area south of Mountain View, a Santa Clara County community about 10 miles west of Milpitas and accessible to other growing industrial areas in Silicon Valley. The AFSC, however, could not find a financial institution in the San Francisco Bay or San Jose areas willing to provide funds for development that would permit sales to African Americans. After a few months, an AFSC official flew to New York to meet with a Quaker vice president of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, who, despite his skepticism about the feasibility of integrated suburban development, agreed to issue a loan for initial construction. Only as a result of this Quaker connection was the AFSC able to obtain a financial commitment. It may also have helped that Metropolitan Life was a bit chastened by the reversal of its racial segregation policy by New York City and state legislative bodies. But when the builder's intent to sell both to black people and white people became known, the Santa Clara Board of Supervisors rezoned the site from residential to industrial use. When he found a second plot, Mountain View officials told him that they would never grant the necessary approvals. He next identified a third tract of land in another town near the Ford plant. When officials discovered that the project would not be segregated, the town adopted a new zoning law, increasing the minimum lot size from 6,000 to 8,000 square feet, making the project unfeasible for working class buyers. After he attempted to develop a fourth site on which he had an option, the seller of the land canceled the option upon learning that the project would be integrated. At that point, the builder gave up. Ben Gross then recruited another builder who proposed to the union that he create two projects, one integrated and the other all-white. Because white buyers would be directed to the all-white project, it was apparent that the plan was for a nominally integrated project would result in an all-black one. The builder proposed to construct the white project in a suburban area, and the integrated one in a less desirable area, and the integrated one in a less desirable environment. A plot sandwiched between the Ford plant and two tracts zoned for heavy industry. Workers at Ford, members of the United Auto Workers (UAW), were divided whether to accept this proposal, and at the next local union election, candidates who opposed the two project concept challenged those who were in favor. It was a difficult decision because the union was faced with choosing between segregated housing and no new housing for any union members, black or white. It was a dilemma similar to the one confronted by Herbert Humphrey and other congressional liberals when they attempted to enact President Truman's housing proposal. But the union decided differently from the congressional liberals. Although the membership was overwhelmingly white, the union adopted a policy that it would support only developers who would commit to integrated housing. A San Jose businessman in the meatpacking business with no previous experience as a developer obtained a tract adjoining David Bohannon's all-white Sunny Hills project and proposed an all-black development. When the UAW and the AFSC became aware of these plans, they persuaded the developer to construct an integrated project instead, and the union promised to promote the project to its whites as well as to its African American members. For 6 months, businessmen sought financing, but every bank or thrift institution he approached, knowing that the FHA backing would be unavailable, either refused to lend money for a project that was open to African American integration. That was open to African Americans, or agreed to lend only if he paid higher interest, a premium for integration ranging from an additional 5.5% to an additional 9%. Such a payment would have greatly increased project costs and made the houses unaffordable to union members. The businessman advised the UAW that he would have to drop his plans. The union was able to persuade him to continue only by promising that the union itself would take responsibility for finding a lender. The UAW and the AFSC representatives again went to New York to ask Metropolitan Life to provide construction financing, which the insurance company agreed to do. In January 1955, more than a year after Ford notified his Richmond workers that their jobs were going to Milpitas, and only a month and a half before the scheduled transfer of automobile of Automobile Assembly, the UAW was able to advise its black members in Richmond that a non-discriminatory housing development called Agua Caliente was going to be available in the Milpitas area. By this time, many white workers had already found housing in racially restricted Santa Clara County neighborhoods. David Bohannon's company, however, remained fiercely opposed to an integrated project adjoining Sunny Hills, and after a San Francisco newspaper article revealed the plan to establish the first subdivision in the Bay Area where black families will be sold homes without discrimination, the company began to pressure the newly formed Milpitas City Council to prevent the construction of Agua Caliente by denying it access to sewer lines. The sanitary district for Milpitas, whose chair was a member of the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors, and whose other members were the Milpitas. I'm going to keep going Milpitas. Might be Milpitas though. I'm gonna change. You know what? I can change. I'm gonna just No, that's a bad thing to say. I'm open to suggestions. Where the Milpitas mayor and a Milpitas city councilman had advised the Agua Caliente builder that its fee for sewer access would be $100 an acre, based on their project's anticipated use of about 3% of the sewer line's capacity. The union and its builders estimated project costs and set sale prices using this figure. Metropolitan Life had extended its financing based on it. Under pressure from David Bohannon's company, the Sanitary District Board held an emergency meeting and adopted an ordinance that increased the sewer connection fee by more than 10 times the $100 figure. Wow. The new charge caused the builder to suspend work. He attempted unsuccessfully to negotiate a compromise with the sanitary district and the Bohannon organization, whose representatives acknowledged that the purpose of the ordinance was to prevent minorities from living close to Sunny Hills. The mayor of Milpitas, however, denied that his motive in voting to increase the sewer fee was discriminatory, but added that he did not think it would be a great loss if the subdivision never got developed because, he asserted, the Ford Workers Tract would depress property values in Milpitas. A real estate agent himself, the mayor claimed that black people inquiring about housing had told them that they did not want to go where they weren't wanted. He was only deferring to these customers' wishes, he said, and declining to show them properties in the city. Okay, so this man is alleging that some black people came to him and said they don't want to go where they aren't wanted. And instead of trying to make them feel wanted, instead of trying to make them feel valued, instead of trying to integrate, instead of trying to make a safe place for them, instead of trying to create a safe environment for integration and for their lives and for the lives of these families with children, he said, okay, bye then. I was reading some of this stuff that actually, it's hard to believe that some of this stuff happened, but it's also very easy to believe that a lot of this stuff happened. It's very easy to believe a lot of this stuff happened. Frustratingly so. problems persisted even after the UAW's builder indicated he would proceed with the Agua Caliente project, despite the higher sewer connection fees. The Bohannon Group next filed suit to prevent the project from using a drainage ditch alongside its track. This was purely a nuisance suit because the draining ditch belonged to the county, not to Bohannon. The UAW then mounted a public campaign against the Sunny Hills project. Not only did the union, Not only did union members refrain from purchasing the houses, but they flooded open houses to disrupt sales to white buyers. Meanwhile, the UAW and AFSC contacted California Attorney General Edmund C. Pat Brown, who sent an assistant to Milpitas to investigate the sewer fee controversy. Brown promised to help in overcoming any racial discrimination by governmental units which might be disclosed. The Agua Caliente builder could no longer sustain the delays, nor could he afford the legal bills that would be incurred if he persisted. The Bohannon Company, perhaps influenced by the Attorney General's implicit threat, was also tired of the fight. The union's boycott had been responsible, or partly responsible, for the company being struck with finished but unsold homes. In November 1955, both the Agua Caliente builder and Bohannon sold out to a new developer recruited by the UAW, making the sewer connection controversy moot, and a combined project was finally constructed. The combined development took the name of the original Bohannon project, Sunny Hills. California banks and thrift institutions continued to refuse, without an exorbitant interest rate surcharge, to issue individual mortgages, without FAA insurance, to borrowers living in an integrated project. At first, the UAW's own pension fund offered to guarantee African American workers loan repayments. Eventually, the FHA agreed to guarantee mortgages with a favorable. I don't know why I'm struggling with that. I've never struggled with that word before. Mortgages. Okay, mortgages. There we go. I think so. Agreed to guarantee mortgages with a favorable rate only if the subdivision was converted to a cooperative, in which the owners would possess shares of the overall project rather than their individual houses. The union and its member buyers agreed, and on the basis, 20 of the project's first 500 units were sold to African American families. By this time, however, the Milpitas Ford plant had been operational for nearly a year, and almost all white workers who wanted to move to the area had done so. The delays, legal fees, and financing problem had raised the cost of the combined Sunny Hills project to a level that was unaffordable to all but the most highly skilled and highly paid Ford workers. Many of the African American workers had become so discouraged about housing opportunities in the Milpitas area that like Frank Stevenson, they had formed carpools to share the 100-mile daily round trip from Richmond. As a last alternative, the UAW and other area unions pressed for public authority to create rental housing, but the idea was met with strong resistance from the local finance and real estate industry. The local Association of Saving and Loan Institutions called it dangerous to our American way of life. And the county refused to act. In the ensuing years, African American residents in Milpitas continued to be confused to Sunny Hills. Continued to be confined to Sunny Hills, and a relatively undesirable project. Built in the 1960s between two freeways and a heavily trafficked main shopping thoroughfare, the Ford plant closed in 1984. Milpitas is no longer all white. It now has many Hispanic and Asian families, but the effects of its early segregation remain visible. African Americans make up only 2% of the population. As the Milpitas area developed, other plants transferred there from the Oakland-Richmond corridor. One was a trailmobile factory that relocated from Berkeley in 1955. Soon after, the plant manager announced a change in the hiring policy. The company would accept only new workers who lived in the vicinity, and they, of course, were almost exclusively white. Black workers, he said, could spur panic selling and white flight. Without knowing that the developer intended an integrated project, the village approved his plans, and water and sewer and street improvements proceeded. Work had begun on 2 model homes when village officials discovered his intent. Almost immediately, speculators did arrive and attempt to create fear among village residents by offering to purchase their properties for as little as half of fair market values. A citizen committee was organized, and 600 protesters marched on a town board meeting being held in a school gymnasium. By a show of hands, the crowd vowed its uncompromising rejection of integration. 600 people. The police were unable or unwilling to prevent the model homes from being vandalized. A survey of Deerfield residents found that opposition to the development ran nearly 8-1. The day after the survey results were announced, the village's park district announced it would condemn the land. The idea was not new. Several months earlier, voters had rejected a proposal that the new district take these properties. But now they overwhelmingly approved a bond issue for that purpose. A federal court held that the park district's exploitation of community hostility to integration was not unlawful because the district was not itself racially motivated. It had unsuccessfully attempted to get okay, that threw me off a little bit. Let's see. Okay, there we are. It unsuccessfully attempted to get voter approval before the likelihood of African American buyers had arisen. The court concluded that voters cannot be compelled to express non-racial motives at the ballot box. By this logic, though, a Democratic vote could insulate any racial discrimination action from legal challenge. The Bill of Rights and Civil War amendments are designed to restrict popular majorities in just this way. Wow. At the time, condemning a proposed African American resident for park purposes was a useful device for whites-only communities because, as the Missouri Appeals Court ruled, Also in 1959, the judicial system could not inquire as to the motives for a condemnation, provided that the purpose of the condemnation was public, which a part surely was. In the Missouri case, an African-American couple had attempted to build a home in the white St. Louis suburb of Creve Coulthard. I don't know. Let's come up again. It does come up again. I'm going to go with Creve Coulthard. Again, permits had been approved and work had begun when the town discovered that the purchasers were African American. A hastily organized citizen committee then raised contributions to purchase the property. White property owner groups frequently attempted to deploy when faced with integration. You good? Okay. When faced with integration. In Lorraine Hansberry 1959 play, A Raisin in the Sun, an owners group in a white Chicago community attempts. An owners group and a white community I messed up. I've been messing up. Let's start this over. In Lorraine Hansberry's 1959 play, A Raisin in the Sun, an owners group in a white Chicago community attempts a similar buyout of African American neighbors, as in the Hansberry drama. How would you say this? How would you say this?
Creve Coeur?
Creve Coeur?
I don't know.
Creve Coeur?
English.
Yes.
Names.
Yes. Creve Coeur. I'll go with that. The Creve Coeur couple refused the officer.
You can spell things too. That's what I've been doing. If I can't pronounce it, I just say.
Okay. It says Creve Coeur. Okay, I'll go with that. I'll go with that. Creve Coeur. You been spelling it?
Yeah, if I get to something and I know I'm butchering it, I spell it too, so people know what I'm trying to say.
The city then condemned the property for recreational use. Condemnations of property and manipulations of zoning designations to prevent African Americans from building occurred almost routinely in the 1950s and 1960s. But one case caught national attention. In 1969, a Methodist church-sponsored nonprofit organization proposed to construct a federally subsidized, racially integrated complex for moderate and low-income families in Blackjack. An all-white suburb in the unincorporated St. Louis County. In response, voters in Blackjack incorporated their community and adopted a zoning ordinance that prohibited future developments of more than three homes per acre. This development of new moderate income housing impossible, although such modest units already existed within the new city boundaries. Several African Americans in St. Louis City sued. They claimed that they had been unable to find decent homes outside the ghetto and therefore had little access to jobs that were increasingly suburban. The incident attracted national attention, and the Nixon administration deliberated for many months about whether to file its own suit to enjoin the joining process. Eventually, it did, and a federal appeals court ordered Blackjack to permit the pro-integration group to proceed. The court observed that hostility to the development was repeatedly expressed in racial terms by persons whom the district court found to be leaders of the incorporation movement, by individuals circulating petitions, and by zoning commissioners themselves. The court continued, racial criticism of the criticism of the proposed development was made and cheered at public meetings. The uncontradicted evidence indicates that at all levels of opposition, race played a significant role, both in the drive to incorporate and the decision to rezone. Citing similar cases from elsewhere in the country, the court concluded that blackjack actions were but one more factor confining black people to low-income housing in the center city, confirming that the inexorable process whereby St. Louis metropolitan area becomes one that has the racial shape of a donut, with the black people in the hole and mostly white people occupying the ring. That does, going off of what we were talking about earlier this morning, that does make me think of Pastor Shelby, and his talks about confinement, and maybe we can go back and post them. I think that would be a good idea. I think maybe I can go back and see what I can find and post them. When he talks heavily about the confinement and containment policies that happen here in Rockford. I think I still have those videos. I can go back and find them. Okay. The court further noted that blackjack's actions were exacerbating residential segregation that was, in large measure, the result of deliberate racial discrimination in the housing market by the real estate industry and by agencies of the federal, state, and local governments. This is the juror segregation. The Methodist organization, however, did not win its legal victory until 1974, 5 years after it had proposed the integration project. By then, financing was no longer available. Interest rates had climbed, and the federal government had become less supportive of subsidizing integrated housing. The lawyers for the church group said, despite the court ruling, no developer in his or her right mind would proceed with the project in the face of such hostility. It was never built. Justice delayed is justice denied was a frequent experience of African Americans having to fight legal battles to obtain housing in white neighborhoods. While many de jure segregation policies aim to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts, so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. Slum clearancy was a way to accomplish this. By the mid-20th century, slum and blight were widely understood euphemisms for African American neighborhoods. Once government had succeeded in preventing black families from joining their white peers in the suburbs and in concentrating them within a few urban districts, these communities were indeed blighted. In many cases, slum clearance could have been a good idea, where low-income African Americans were living in squalor. Plans to demolish substandard structures and provide new, decent homes in integrated neighborhoods would have been appropriate. But mostly, policymakers contemplated no such relocation. Instead, slum clearance reinforced the spatial segregation of African Americans, as well as their impoverishment. This, in turn, led to further segregation because the more impoverished African Americans became, the less welcome they were in middle-class communities. This just goes back to things we were talking about earlier, that all this is purposeful. These were tactical decisions made. No coincidences. One slum clearance tool was the construction of the federal interstate highway system. In many cases, state and local governments with federal acquiescence designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. Highway planners did not hide their racial motivations. The story of such highway planning begins in 1938, when the federal government first considered aid for interstate highways. Secretary of Agriculture and subsequently Vice President Henry Wallace proposed to President Roosevelt that highways routed through the cities could also accomplish the elimination of unsightly and unsanitary districts. Over the next 2 decades, the linkage between highway construction and the removal of African Americans was a frequent theme of those who stood to profit from a federal road building program. They found that an effective way to argue a case for highway spending was to stress the capacity of road construction to make business districts and their environs white. Mayors and other urban political leaders joined in, seizing on highway construction as a way to overcome the constitutional prohibition on zoning African Americans away from white neighborhoods near downtowns. In 1943, the American Concrete Institute urged the construction of urban expressways for the elimination of slums and blighted areas. In 1949, the American Road Builders Association wrote to President Truman that if interstates were properly routed through metropolitan areas, they could contribute in a substantial manner to the elimination of slum and deteriorated areas. An important influence on national legislation and administration of the highway system was the Urban Land Institute, whose 1957 newsletter recommended that city governments survey the extent to which blighted areas may provide suitable highway routes. By 1962, By 1962, the Highway Research Board boasted that interstate highways were eating out slums and reclaiming blighted areas. Alfred Johnson, the executive director of the American Association of State Highway Officials, was the lobbyist most deeply involved with the congressional committee that wrote the 1956 Highway Act. He later recalled that some city officials would express the view in the mid-1950s and that the urban interstates would give them a good opportunity to get rid of the local, he says, the N-word towns. His expectation did not go unfulfilled. Hamtramck, Michigan, for example, was an overwhelmingly Polish enclave surrounded by Detroit. The city's 1959 master plan called for a program of population loss, understood to refer to a small number of African American residents. In 1962, with federal urban renewal funds, the city began to demolish African American neighborhoods. The first project cleared land for expansion of a Chrysler automobile factoring plant. Then, federal dollars were used to raise more homes to make way for the Chrysler Expressway, leading to the plant. In advance, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights had warned that the expressway would displace about 4,000 families, 87% of whom were African American. Wow. 12 years later, a federal appeals court concluded that HUD officials knew that the highway would disproportionately destroy African American homes and make no provisions for assisting them in finding new lodging. The record supports a finding that HUD must have known of the discriminatory practices which pervaded the private housing market, and the indications of overt prejudice among some of the persons involved in carrying out the urban renewal projects of the city. The court-ordered remedy was construction of new housing in the city only for those families who had been displaced, who could still be found. Who could still be found. I'm sorry, it was a comma that was appeared. Who could still be found, and who had indicated to interviewers that they would be willing to return to Hamtramck. Because the litigation had dragged on, their number was a small share of those who had suffered harm, most of whom had no choice but to move into the Detroit ghetto. Federal interstate highways buttressed segregation in cities across the country. In 1956, the Florida State Road Department routed I-95 to do what Miami's unconstitutional zoning ordinance had intended but failed to accomplish 2 decades earlier. Clear African Americans from an area adjacent to downtown. An alternative route utilizing an abandoned railway right-of-way was rejected, although it would have resulted in little population removal. When the highway was eventually completed in the mid-1960s, it had reduced. When the highway was eventually completed in the mid-1960s, it had reduced a community of 40,000 African Americans to 8,000. In Camden, New Jersey, an interstate highway destroyed some 3,000 low-income housing units from 1963 to 1967. A report by the New Jersey State Attorney General Office concluded, "It is obvious from a glance at the transit plans that an attempt is being made to eliminate black people and Puerto Rican ghetto areas by building highways that benefit white suburbanites, facilitating their movement from the suburbs to work and back." Wow. I don't know how well you'll be able to see this, but this is children in Miami watching their home be destroyed. In Los Angeles, routing of the Santa Monica Freeway in 1954 destroyed the city's most prosperous black middle-class area, Sugar Hill, in an all-too-familiar series of events. When the first African American arrived, an insurance company executive, an insurance company executive arrived there in 1938, neighborhood association leaders suggested to him that he would be happier if he lived elsewhere. When the executive failed to act on that advice, the group proposed to buy the property from him, but then could not raise the funds. In 1945, a few middle-class African Americans had settled in Sugar Hill, and the association went to court to apply its restrictive covenant and have them evicted. But anticipating the U.S. Supreme Court's Shelley ruling by 3 years, a state judge ruled that enforcement of the covenant would violate the 14th Amendment. After more African Americans bought homes in the area, the Los Angeles City Council rezoned the neighborhood for rentals over the protests of affluent African Americans who had already lived in Sugar Hill. More lower income black families then moved in. The routing of the Santa Monica Freeway through Sugar Hill succeeded in demolishing the black community where other efforts have failed. African American leaders pleaded that the freeway be shifted slightly north, but the city engineer dismissed their concerns, assuring them that they would have up to 5 years to find new housing before properties were seized. In a few of these cases, the federal or local agencies provide assistance to displace African Americans in finding adequate and safe new housing. When enacted into law in 1956, the Interstate Highway Program did not impose even a nominal obligation on federal or state governments to assist those whose residences were being demolished. Although the House version of the bill permitted but did not require payment of moving costs to tenants in demolished homes, the Eisenhower administration objected. Council of Economic Advisors Chairman Arthur Burns warned that compensation would run up the cost of the highway program, predicting that the system would evict nearly 100,000 people a year as it grew. The Senate then removed language permitting such payments from the final legislation. In 1965, the federal government began to require the new housing be provided for those forced to relocate by future interstate highway construction. But by then, the interstate system was nearly complete. Time to move?
Yeah.
Alright. We came to the end of this section. So we're on page 132. At the top of 132, we're going to end this live. We're going to move to prepare for the rain. We'll be back 15